Get started. All right, so again, apply for scholarships that are out there. So let's then keep going with carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, we say are organic compounds. How do we know they're organic or not? Because they contain carbon and hydrogen. Good. They also contain oxygen. What's the one thing that proteins have that carbohydrates don't have? What's the one atom they have? Nitrogen, that's right. And they're made by plants by the process called photosynthesis. And so CO2 plus water will help to make glucose, all right? Many glucose molecules together make starch. So starch is made up of what? Many glucose. What is glucose? Guys, you put your phones up. Sugar. Yeah, it's all sugar linked. It's how plants store sugar, all right? And then we eat the plants and we get the starch. Fiber also is made of glucose, but the bonds are more complex. So starch molecules are made by glucose linked together with something called an alpha bond, and they're easily broken in digestion. Versus fiber is beta bonds, and they're harder to break, and so then they go into the colon. They're not broken apart by the enzymes. So how many, what percent of our kilocalories should be carbohydrates? 45 to 65%. And how many kilocalories do carbohydrates provide? This is kind of like a mini review for the test, right? 4 kilocalories per gram. So we have, when we break it down, we have simple carbohydrates, and we have complex carbohydrates. So our simple carbohydrates are monosaccharides and disaccharides. When we see this word monosaccharides, what do you think this mono means? One sugar. Di means 2 sugars. Di always means 2, right? Versus poly means many sugars. You see saccharides, we're thinking all these sugars linked together, right? So we see starch. This is how plants put together glucose to store it up, right? What's this guy right here? Glycogen. Have you ever heard of him? Anyone? Muscles, yes, and our liver. So it's how our muscles and our liver store extra sugar that's needed, because our brain, our nervous system, the cells in the nervous system, our neurons, and our red blood cells have to have glucose for a source of energy to make ATP. And so we can store it in our muscles, and muscles can use also that stored glycogen for sugar for their own use, and then our liver can make it for the rest of the body. And then we talked about fiber that cannot be digested and broken down, so it goes on out through as waste. Okay, so that's just showing you. There's the chemical composition of glucose if you want to sound smart when you go talk to your friends. So glucose is C6H12O6. What is C? Carbon. So 6 carbons. How many hydrogen? 12. How many oxygen? Yeah, that's pretty fun, right? And in that process of creating oxygen, all right? So our job of carbs is to give us what? Energy, and also helps to spare protein. So like someone on a high protein diet that's low carbs, they're using the carbohydrates to make, they're using the proteins to make glucose, okay? And that process of taking the amino acids from proteins to make glucose is called gluconeogenesis. And we'll talk about that one in a little bit. But you see the word gluco, you think of what? Sugar. Neo means new. Genesis means creation, in the beginning, right? The first book of the Bible, right? Genesis. So gluconeogenesis. Creating glucose from something that's not sugar, right? So we can take something from proteins called amino acids and make glucose. And that's how people on high protein diets, their brain's functioning, right? We'll talk about that one here in just a bit, and we'll talk about later when we get into that chapter on proteins. Also, we need 50 to 100 grams of carbs, even if you're on a low-carb diet, for normal fat metabolism to occur. So 50 to 100 grams of carbs for normal fat metabolism and to prevent ketones from building up, okay? And then, of course, we talk about fiber, all right? So we talked about half of our day's supply of energy should come from carbs, right? and we talked about glycogen, the storage form of glucose in our liver and our skeletal muscles. All right, here we go. So, what is the chemical composition of carbohydrates, and how many kilocalories are in each gram of carbs? And that's on page 156. What is the chemical composition of carbohydrates, and how many kilocalories are in each gram of carb? We know how to calculate kilocalories now, don't we? We're old pros at it. So what is the chemical composition of carbohydrates, and how many kilocalories are in each gram of carbohydrate? All right, so we talked about we had to use proteins to build tissue, so we can spare our proteins from our diet. They can be used to build structural body proteins if we're getting enough carbohydrates in our diet, okay? And then we said ketones, if we're not getting enough carbs, we build up ketones. You've heard of ketogenic diet. That's exactly what they're talking about. We'll talk more about ketosis, upsets the acid-base balance in the body, and we'll talk about that when we get into the diabetics and what goes on with them. All right. A client asked the nurse about starting a high-protein, low-carb diet. What would you say? What's the minimum amount of carbohydrates that you're going to need? This is your think time. Go ahead. So Carb asked the nurse about starting a high-protein, low-carb diet. What's the minimum amount of carbohydrates they're going to need? So what's the minimum amount of carbohydrates you're going to need? All right, and then we talked about fiber, and we talked about which food has the most fiber, and what did we discover? Which food has the most fiber? Beans, yes, very good. All right, so Okies should live forever, right? If we didn't add fat and fry everything, we would, right? So we know where our carbs come from. They come from plant foods. There's one exception to plant foods where we can get carbohydrates. Can you think of any place where we can also get carbohydrates other than from plants? Milk. What's milk sugar called? Lactose. Good. All right. So these are the names of the monosaccharides, the single sugars. All right. So glucose. Glucose has another name. Let me go down and get you a pen, and let's do black. All right, do you know the other name of glucose? You guys know what its name is? If you're working on a floor in a hospital, he's also called what? Dextrose. That's right. You see those IV bags? 5% dextrose? They're talking about what? Glucose. This one is also the one we find circulating in our blood that our cells need, and that they will use to convert to make ATP. And so this one's one we call blood sugar. So glucose is also called blood sugar. And I'm using the little online marker so my online students can have. And I'm getting better with it, but not much better. This is called blood sugar. S-U-G-A-R, sorry. Messy. I'm getting not so good with it. I need some. All right. What about fructose? Have you ever heard of fructose? What is fructose? Fruit sugars. Where else would you find it? Anyone? Honey. Yeah, honey. And in fact, it draws water real bad, and that's why honey is liquid instead of solid. You know how it gets crystalline, and you can heat it up and melt it? drive out some of that water, and it'll go back to liquid state. So is fructose super sweet? Yes, yes. So if you eat a lot of fruit and if you eat a lot of honey, this sugar, your liver will convert the fructose back into what? Glucose. Yeah, the liver gets to do that. Yeah. And then this guy, have you ever heard of galactose? No. All right. So this guy is part of lactose, because lactose is a what? Disaccharide, meaning what? 2 sugars, right? So let's talk about what lactose. We started right off with lactose. So we know lactose must be made up of 2 sugars. So the 2 sugars that make lactose are what? Galactose plus what? Galactose. Y'all found this one? It's in your book. Galactose plus what? Sorry, my writing is not so great with my mouse. I need a little pen.
Glucose.
Glucose, yes. Good. 2 sugars linked together with alpha bond. Is that going to be a good bond, easy to break? Yes, it is. Glucose, there's a C in there. All right, glucose. All right. What about sucrose? Is that made up of 2 sugars? What 2 sugars make up sucrose? Glucose and fructose. All right, glucose. We're going to abbreviate this time. Maybe it'll help a little bit better. First, fructose. Are glucose and fructose monosaccharides? Yes, 2 monosaccharides together make a disaccharide with alpha bond. Easily broken? Yes, easily digest and absorb. What about this guy, maltose? He's called malt sugar, right? We see this in the brewing industry. He's made up of what? 2 glucoses. Yeah, glucose plus glucose, yeah. All right, now I'm going to teach you something you might not know. Let's do this one real quick and I'll come back to it. So poly means what? Many. What's some polysaccharides? Starch. Many what? Starch, sorry, starch. My mouse is not so good. Many glucose linked together. Alpha bonds? What do you think? Can we digest and absorb, break it apart so we can absorb? Yeah, many glucose. Linked together with alpha bonds. Easily broken. Can starchy foods raise a diabetic's blood sugar quick? Yes. So where would we find starchy foods? Potatoes, beans. Are beans a good source of starch? Unfortunately, they're a good source of fiber, but they're also a good source of starch. Yeah. So what about rice, breads? All of those are a great source of starch. All of these can really raise a diabetic patient's what? Blood glucose. Because starch is made up of what? Many glucose, or many sugars, glucose sugars linked together with alpha bond or beta bond? Alpha bond. Easily broken? Indeed. All right. What's another type of polysaccharide? Glycogen. And where do we have glycogen? Yeah, muscles and liver. And it's made up of what? Many glucose. Yeah, good answer. And we're just going to do like this. Means the same, right? And it's in our liver. You guys can't get this down enough because you get to phys. Just going to ask you this. You get in nursing. All right. So when we talk about carb loading, and this is where we load our sugars in our muscles and our liver to give us an advantage when we're working out and runners and all that. All right. What's another type of polysaccharide? Poly meaning many. What do you think? Y'all remember? Fiber. But what do we know about fiber? Alpha bonds or beta bonds? Many glucose, we'll do that one with beta. This will help the online students because sometimes our book's kind of hard. Beta bonds. Harder to break, so they don't get digested and broken apart. So do we really give kilocalories with fiber? No, because the bonds aren't broken apart. They mostly get into your colon. Now, however, there are bacteria in the colon that can ferment some of those fibers so they can have a party in your colon, basically. Your bacteria can. And so some of them can provide like 1 kilocalorie. But we say none overall. And so they basically, a lot of them are undigestible, so we say they go out. All right. So you guys good with this? Oh, we're going to talk real quickly about the enzymes that break apart the disaccharides. So let's talk about the enzymes in our small intestine. So we have to have digestive enzymes to break apart the polysaccharides and the disaccharides. These are the only ones that can be absorbed by our small intestine. Small intestine can only absorb these guys, our monosaccharides. We get into the chapter on digestion, you guys will be good to go. Okay? So only glucose, fructose, and galactose can be absorbed by our small intestine cells. So these guys are going to have to be broken apart before they can be absorbed. So we have digestive enzymes, IES, sorry, this is kind of messy, that help to break these apart. So let me give you their names, so this will help you a lot. So we see sucrose, the digestive enzyme that breaks apart sucrose is called sucrase. RASE. And it's on the small intestine cell. We have this little digestive enzyme called sucrase, ASE. Anytime you see ASE, you're automatically going to think of enzymes. Huh, that's handy, isn't it? Anytime we see ASE, we're automatically thinking of an enzyme. Now, not all enzymes have ASE on them, but a bunch of them do, all right? So what do you think this sucrase enzyme is going to do to sucrose? It's going to break the alpha bond and break it apart into what? Go with me? Glucose and fructose. So can you think of any other enzymes we might need? Lactase, good. Lactase. What do you think lactase is going to break apart? Good. What's lactose going to be broken apart into? Glucose and galactose, good. All right, what about this guy? Maltase, you guys have it, it's down. That's it, that's all it is to it. All right, what is maltose going to be broken down into to be absorbed? 2-glucose, yeah. All right, maltase. All right, so we have to have these digestive enzymes to break these sugars apart so we can digest them. So we look at any of these sugars. Do we see any that cause us issues? Y'all ever heard of any digestive issues with any of these disaccharides? Lactose intolerance, all right? And we said this one is called what? Milk sugar, right? Milk sugar. Milk. We find it in milk. So, you know, people that drink milk or cheese or any kind of dairy, and what happens? What's the symptoms of lactose intolerance? It's what? Lactose. I'm sorry. Writing with a mouse is hard. Y'all should try it. Intolerance. How they feel besides grumpy? They feel bad, don't they? So tummy issues. What are the examples? Diarrhea. Big time. They gotta go right then. What else? Bloating, rumbling, gassy, right? This doesn't sound fun, does it? Gassy. What else?
Oh, you said gassy.
Gassy. All of these things.
Is lactose intolerant, so she always very nervous acid.
Yeah, because they're having all these issues. And so if they drink dairy, yep, they're having issues, right? And so what could they do? Limit dairy or find what? Lactose-free what? Milk? Or is it
We'll drink the
soy milks? That's a lot of people. There is something called lactate, right? What do you think lactate is? It's this enzyme, right? You dump it in your milk, pretty soon it breaks apart the lactose into galactose and glucose, right? See all that? All right. So what happens is this lactose cannot be broken apart, so it gets down in the colon, and that's where all the gaseous bloating and diarrhea. So it draws water, the sugar draws water, causes the diarrhea, causes the bacteria having a party fermenting it, and we have bloating and gassy. Yeah. So this is a common symptom you guys will see a lot. Now this is the thing that you really, in a healthy patient, it's not fun. But what about if you have a patient in the hospital, maybe they're recovering from the flu or they're aged? Is this lactose intolerance a big deal? Could they get weaker? Absolutely. Could they get dehydrated? Yeah, this becomes a big issue. So this is really what you have to watch about. We talked about special diets. In this type of diet, maybe they came in with the flu. And so we talk about clear liquid diets. Y'all ever heard of clear liquid? What is clear liquid?
Anything you can see through.
Anything you can see through. Good examples are what? Clear liquid? Broth. Broth. What else? Popsicles. Yeah. Jello. Yeah, all those things like that. All right. What about a full liquid? What's full liquid? The difference. You guys will be charting. You guys need to know about this. What's example things you can have in full liquid diet?
Well, wouldn't that be like ice cream?
Ice cream. All right. What else? What about cream soups? Mm-hmm. What else? Sherbet, right? Non-clear, right, as long as it's liquid. So if you have a patient that's coming in on the flu and they just recovered from the flu and they put them on a full liquid diet and you put them on these and then you find out they have lactose intolerance. Did they get sicker and weaker? Is that a bad deal?
Yes.
You guys are going to be on the floor. If you know they have lactose intolerance, you see it anywhere charted on their chart, or if they're older, there's a big chance they do have lactose intolerance because as we age, often we'll lose the enzyme lactase. They will be often, and if they're recovering from the flu, often they'll be lactose intolerant anyway after they recover. So this little thing, this full liquid, can be a big issue. So the doctor puts them on a clear liquid diet. Is there any, we'll talk about this one a little bit more. This one doesn't have any protein in it. Is the patient going to recover? No. So when we talk about healing, so what could the patient have on a full liquid? Could they have Ensure? It's made from soy. Yes, they can. Can they have soy milk? If they can tolerate soy, yes. So you can make soups from those things. Almond milk, soy milk, yeah. You guys are going to be watching out for these patients because often they'll get more and more and more and more sick. You can see how that happens, right? Because this is the first go-to for any patient that's feeling a little bit under the weather. There's a full liquid diet, okay? All right. So let's do a think time. Y'all ready? All right, so we talked about monosaccharides, and that's just their chemical structure, the monos versus the disaccharides. By the way, sucrose is also called table sugar. You remember those little sugar cubes I passed around? That's sucrose, or table sugar, we call it. Okay, and we talked about what the bonds were. All right, and if you'll notice, see, lactose has a beta bond. Is that a harder bond to break? That's why a lot of people have issues with it. Okay. So we talked about it. The people who are most likely to suffer from lactose intolerance include anyone of ethnic descent, basically, which is a majority of Oklahoma people. Any Native American history, typically they're going to be lactose intolerant. So those who can tolerate are Scandinavian descent. All right, not so much in Oklahoma. All right, here you go. List the monosaccharides, list the disaccharides, and each of the sugars that make up each of the disaccharides. So list the monos. What's the monosaccharides? List the disaccharides and the sugars that make up each of the disaccharides. And if you need help, it's on page 158. So list the monosaccharides, list the disaccharides, and then what are the sugars that make up each of the disaccharides? All right, and now the next one. List the enzymes that break apart the disaccharides. Well, so what's the name of the digestive enzymes that break apart the bonds in the disaccharides? So what are the names of the enzymes that break up each of the disaccharides? And I gave you a real easy hint on those. That makes it handy, doesn't it? So what are the names of the digestive enzymes that break apart the disaccharides for digestion? So they can be absorbed as monosaccharides. So what are the name of the enzymes? So what are the name of the enzymes that help to break apart the disaccharides? By the way, on lactose intolerance, some patients, not all of them, can tolerate hard cheeses and yogurt because in the process of making cheese and yogurt, the bacteria ferment the yogurt and they help to break down the lactose. And in cheese making, you lose a lot of lactose in the whey. And so some people can tolerate hard cheeses and yogurt if they're lactose intolerant. But if you have an older patient and they're lactose intolerant, leave it alone, especially if they're in the hospital. Help them to recover, okay? So I'd keep them off of lactose. On page 159, it talks about something called oligosaccharides, those with 5 to 10 sugars. And these have beta bonds. So these are things that we see in broccoli and cabbage and beans that cause all the issues. And they have beta bonds. So raffinose, stachyose, these are those type of sugars with beta bonds. And so this is what causes all the gassiness and swelling that you get when you eat beans. And so there's an enzyme in Beano which helps break apart those beta bonds so they can be digested. So you guys know all about beans and cabbage, and a lot of patients say, I can't eat those foods, they make me too gassy, all right? That's why. All right, so we talked about acidophilus milk too, another thing. All right, here we go. Your client complains of bloating, abdominal cramps, and diarrhea after drinking milk or consuming milk-based foods such as processed cheese. What is the likely cause of the symptoms, and what recommendations can be made? That's almost the same question on that one. Oh, no, it's two separate questions. What is the likely cause of these symptoms? When I wrote this, I didn't. And then what causes it and what recommendations can be made. So your patient said they're bloating, they have abdominal cramps, and diarrhea after they drank milk or milk-based foods. What's the likely cause? What are you going to give us possible diagnosis and what causes it? Why? Why is that so? And then what recommendations can be made? You see a lot of little kids with this disease condition, or with this condition, don't you? This digestive disorder, we call it. It's not really a disease, it's a digestive disorder. Mhm. Anyone recovering from the flu will likely have these same symptoms. Did you have these symptoms after the flu? Especially any stomach bug, the stomach type. Okay. Yeah. A week, yeah. It's terrible, isn't it? That's flu stuff. All right. So what recommendations would you make? Mm-mm. Yeah. It's a tough one. Y'all get all of the questions? Y'all good? All right. So what would it say? The cause of those symptoms? What causes it? Why? Why, I should say. Why do they have it? And what recommendations can be made? Why would have been better on the second one. Why? Why do they have it?
I'm really struggling with this chapter.
Are you?
Yeah, he's just over here naming them off like it's nothing. And,
Maybe y'all should sit together.
well,
It's think times, right? Okay, think times. You can talk to your neighbor about that. Don't you love it? Yeah. Here we go. Polys mean what? Many sugars linked together. All right, we talked about them. All right. All right. So where do we store lots of glycogen, both in our muscles and our liver. And this is just showing you how glycogen, many glucose molecules linked together. Starch can be two different types, amylopectin and amylose. So different foods will have mixtures of the two types of starch. So let me give you an example. Red potatoes, you guys have heard about red potatoes. If the patient has diabetes, it may not raise their blood sugar as bad as white potatoes or Irish potatoes. That's because white potatoes have more amylopectin, or branch chain, and red potatoes have more amylose. So why the blood sugars don't go up as quickly is anything with a branch, the enzyme amylase can break those bonds quicker on something branched, right? Versus one at a time on that long chain. Does that make sense? So it'll raise amylopectin foods typically will raise blood sugars quicker than amylose containing starch foods. Yeah. So that's good to know. So lots of foods are mixtures of both amylose and amylopectins. Okay? And then we sometimes call glycogen animal starch because of how we store it in our body. Where do we store glycogen? Liver and our skeletal muscles. Now, our liver can release the glucose into our blood, but our skeletal muscles can only use the glucose for their own use. We call them energy hogs, our skeletal muscles. All right, we talked about fiber being insoluble and soluble. And the difference between them, you guys can go back through those. And we said, which one lowers your blood cholesterol? Soluble or insoluble? Soluble fibers. Which one can lower your blood sugars? Soluble. Yeah, soluble's also. And the way, again, lowering cholesterol is the bile in the small intestine can bind to the soluble fibers, and instead of being reabsorbed, it goes out through the colon. Yeah, help lowering our cholesterol because bile is made up of cholesterol. All right, so we told you where you can find starchy foods, and that's why they raise their blood sugar so quickly for diabetic patients. So these are the foods you really want to watch out for, things like corn and potatoes. We call corn in Oklahoma a vegetable, but corn is actually a starch. We need to call it, yeah, it's a grain. We need to call it what it is, right? It's a grain. And so we want to kind of help watch out for our patients on that. And we talked about pectins and gums and mucilaginous soluble fibers already. So here we go. List the polysaccharides. Which polysaccharide is stored in the body, and what are polysaccharides made up of? So list the polysaccharides. What is the polysaccharide stored in the body? And what are polysaccharides made up of? And we talked about them. They're on page 159, 160 if you need some help. 159, 160. What's the name of it? What's the name of the polysaccharide that's stored in the body? Yeah, what is the name of the polysaccharide stored in the body? And what are polysaccharides made up of? The individual units they're made up of. So list the polysaccharides. What is the polysaccharide that's stored in the body? And what are polysaccharides made up of? All right, and this question goes with 6. Where is number 6 stored in the body? Where is number 6 stored in the body? Where is number 6 stored in the body? The polysaccharide that's stored in the body, where? Where are they stored? Do you remember that one, number 6? The polysaccharide that's stored in the body? And if you forget, you can always ask a neighbor, right? That's what think times are all about. It's good to find a good neighbor. So where are they stored? Where is this polysaccharide stored? Where is it stored? One that's stored in the body. Okay, y'all ready to go on? No, hang on a second. Okay, so where is the polysaccharide stored in the body? Page 160, right? 161, right? You need some help? If you do your Learn Smarts before you come to class, it'll really help you a lot too in the class. It'll help you understand it more.
Well, I did this Learn Smart last week, and I have not looked at this since last week, and this is kicking my butt today.
Good. Take time. Just go back through it, okay? All right, so we talked about cellulose and hemocellulose. We're not, and the soluble inside first. We're not going to talk about that. Okay. Can you take too much fiber in your diet? They say 50 grams or so is too much. It's going to it's going to bind minerals, prevent you from absorbing a lot of your minerals. It can cause blockage, intestinal blockages. With little kids, it may fill them up too full where they're not getting adequate nutrition. So you really kind of want to watch little kids and fiber. They need some fiber, but you don't want to overdo it, okay? It's with anyone. So, again, good fiber's good, but don't go crazy, okay? So 14 grams per 1,000 calories is what's recommended. Most Americans don't get the 20 to 35 grams per day. Some of us are only getting 5 grams a day. Think you're headed for diverticulosis? Yeah, a life of diverticulosis. All right, so of course we talked about where you get all the good sources of it. All right, so let's kind of run through digestion. So digestion begins in the mouth. We have an enzyme called amylase. When you see ASE, what do you think of? Enzyme. So what do you think this enzyme is going to break down? Yeah, amylose, right? Amylopectin. So this one's going to break down starches, won't it? So let me give you a homework assignment. When you get home, you know those old soda crackers we used to call them? Those old regular white saltine crackers? Put one of those. My grandma always called them soda crackers. Put a saltine in your mouth. At first it's going to taste salty, and then it's going to start tasting what? Sweet. Because is the amylase and the saliva going to start breaking apart the starch into what? Glucose. And it'll start tasting sweet. Try that when you get home. You'll see. All right. So we talked about the enzymes. So we have another enzyme made by the pancreas called pancreatic amylase. What do you think pancreatic amylase is going to break down? Amylase is going to break down amylose and amylopectin. Yeah. So this enzyme is going to go right into the small intestine and break apart the rest of the starch. So it's going to start in the mouth, but it's going to be finished in the small intestine, because the small intestine is where we absorb the majority of our nutrients. Are we going to be able to absorb whole polysaccharides? No, only what? Which sugar? Monounsaccharides are the only thing we're going to be able to absorb in our small intestine. And then this is going to go to the liver through the blood supply, the hepatic portal vein. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the fiber goes on through. Okay? So that's just showing you what happens with the enzymes. All right, and how it breaks it apart so that we can absorb the glucose, right? Or the other monosaccharides. And this is just the types of absorption. If it says active absorption, that means it's going to need energy and ATP to absorb these nutrients. So glucose, galactose. Glucose is co-absorbed with sodium. We'll get to that a little bit later. All right. And again, our liver can convert the fructose and galactose into glucose and either store it as glycogen or put it into the blood supply. Excess glucose can be made into what? A triglyceride, a fat, and stored in adipose tissue. That's how, if we drink a lot of soda, it ends up around our middle, right? This is just showing you the absorption of our monosaccharides. They'll go to the liver, okay, through the hepatic portal vein after they're absorbed through the capillaries, okay? All right, and that's just showing you some details. You guys can go back through it, what we talked about. And this is a little video. You guys can go back and watch it. We're not going to watch it right now. So we said the process of breaking apart proteins and using the amino acids from proteins to make glucose is called what? Gluconeogenesis, the creation of glucose from a non-carb source. Okay? And again, this is like someone on a high-protein diet, for example. It can also be used, we see this sometimes with diabetic patients. So we want to maintain blood sugars in a normal range. High blood glucose can cause a lot of issues, fatigue, cause long-term damage to our eyes, our kidneys, any blood vessel in the body. Low blood glucose, you'll see the patient will feel dizzy and feel sick. They may have a headache. They may get cranky, right? So what do we call low blood glucose? We talked about that earlier. Hypoglycemia. What do we call high blood glucose? Hyperglycemia. Are both bad? Yes. And so we can check our blood sugars to see if we're in normal range, right? So our book is classifying normal blood glucose. This is fasting, right, before a meal. After a 12-hour fast is 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. And our pancreas produces a hormone called what? Insulin, that lowers our blood glucose. And basically insulin is like the key that unlocks the cell to let it take up glucose. So what if your patient's pancreas doesn't make insulin? What happens? Yeah, your blood glucose is going to go, whoa. Hyperglycemia, right? A new pancreas? Artificial pancreas?
Yeah. We were helping a girl from Red Oak raise money to get it.
Okay.
Is it supposed to...
It's probably an insulin pump, right?
Well,
It's a sensor. All right, so she asked about a pump that's acts like a pancreas. So I have a sister we're going to talk about type 1 diabetes. So this is exactly what happens in type 1 diabetes. The pancreas is no longer producing what? Insulin. No insulin. All right? So is there a key to unlock the door to tell the cells to take up? No, that looks terrible. No insulin. Yeah. So they're going to have hyperglycemia. So they may be from, 300 to what? 700 milligrams per deciliter. Is that bad? Yeah. So when we talk about hyperglycemia, can it cause them to go into diabetic coma? Hypo or hyperglycemia can cause them to go into diabetic coma. So page 179 in your book talks about the two types of diabetes. Right? So we have two types of diabetes. What are the two types? Type 1 and type 2. Right? So the type where they're no longer making insulin is called what? Type 1. Sometimes we see it in children, right? Can we see it in adults? If they have pancreatitis, where the pancreas digests itself, yeah, you'll see type 1 diabetes then too. Yeah. So I have a little sister who was diagnosed in 2nd grade with type 1 diabetes. This is an autoimmune disease where the antibodies attack the beta cells of the pancreas, destroy the cells that make insulin, all right? So the blood glucose, her blood glucose was around 500. Was she close to a diabetic coma? Yes, very, very dangerous. All right, so what are the symptoms of elevated blood glucose? Dizziness, blurred vision. That's a typical telltale sign that their vision come and goes, right? Especially adults, yeah. Cranky, yeah. Dizzy, headache, feels like hot, flashes, yeah. Feels like top of the head's coming off. What about a lot of urine? They're urinating a lot. Thirsty? Yes. All those are symptoms. Hungry? So we say polyphagia, which means what? Big hunger. They want to eat all the time. Polydipsia means what? Big thirst. You want to drink, right? Because it dehydrates them, the sugar. When they urinate, the sugar goes out in the urine because it's so high. And it draws the water, dehydrate them. Are they going to be very dehydrated? Can it cause their electrolytes to move out? Yes, they're going to need IVs. This one's very, very, very dangerous. And can it lead to death? Absolutely. So they're going to have to take insulin for life. So her pump, this new kind of pump, has sensors on it. Yeah. So it sensors when the blood glucose goes high, it starts kicking out insulin that's already made or that's already stored. They inject it and store the insulin in the little pump, and it releases it just kind of like your pancreas would. Yeah, that's what
She played ball, and so that was like really useful because she was crashing a lot.
Yeah, she was crashing. So what does that mean, crashing? Her blood sugars were dropping. So when she was exercising, her muscles were using that glucose, right? And if she gave herself too much insulin, you'll see this a lot in diabetic patients, the blood sugars plummets, right? Now they have which one, hypo or hyper? Hypoglycemia. So that also can be dangerous and lead to a diabetic coma. So you'll see issues with type 1 and type 2 diabetes on page, again, 179. The majority of patients with diabetes are which one? Type 2. We used to call it adult onset, but we're seeing kids with type 2 diabetes. Typically, what's a symptom or a cause of type 2 diabetes? Diet, overweight. Yeah, they're being overweight. So they may produce insulin, but their cells become resistant to insulin. So we say insulin resistant. So they may give them drugs to tell their liver to quit making so much glucose. They may also tell the cells to become more responsive to insulin. So both are dangerous. But again, this is the one we used to call juvenile diabetes. All right. So this is the hormone that insulin acts to lower blood glucose, right? Which one raises blood glucose? The pancreas makes another hormone called what? Glucagon. And this one raises blood glucose. All right. So this is the one that tells your liver to release glucose in the body. So maybe you didn't eat all day. Do you think you're making a lot of, pancreas is making and releasing a lot of glucagon? Yeah, to keep your blood glucose in normal range. Okay, so normally we don't worry about it. Our body's taking care of things. But again, if we're not in control, then these issues can come up. All right, so these other hormones can also raise our blood sugars. Why does it matter? Cortisol is a stress hormone, so when the patient is ill, they're going to release a lot of cortisol, and it's going to do what? Raise their blood glucose. So during illness, they may need more insulin. They may have to watch the carbs even more. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, these are fight or flight hormones, also play a role raising blood glucose. Okay? So these all can act to raise the blood glucose. And that's just showing you, if you go in for a glucose tolerance test, that's what's the difference between a non-diabetic and a diabetic. A non-diabetic patient, after they drink that little soda with glucose, their blood sugars come down. Diabetics, it stays up. Okay? All right,
So I have a question, if you don't mind.
No, of course.
So, like, a lot of what I see where I work is for elderly patients.
Elderly,
Is type 2 diabetes.
Type 2,
With mellitus.
Diabetes mellitus,
Yeah, the ICD-10 is E11.42. Well, anyway.
A1C, what?
It's the ICD-10 code is E11.42. I just know it because a lot of elderly patients have type 2 diabetes
Yes.
with mellitus.
Yes, diabetes mellitus is how we classify the whole disease condition.
So where does the diabetes, like, like their toes get infected and they start dying, and
I am
what is that?
so glad you asked that question.
I mean, I just want to know how that forms. because
Yeah,
it's
how
just-
does it form?
I mean, I talk to nurses every day of the week, and different nurses, and, I mean, I have,
All right, so type 2, we see this a lot. This is a good thing to go through.
and I just kind of want to know the process of
How it
does-
happens?
Yeah, how does that patient get to the point to where they have to get a toe amputated, or gangrene has set in, or,
All right, so this is how it works. This is a really good question. So elevated blood glucose, if the patient doesn't monitor and keep their blood glucose in normal range, it affects every blood vessel in their body from large to small. Remember us talking, what happens to if you have a lot of sugar in your diet? What does it do? It increases your triglycerides, which are what? Fats? Is that a bad thing? Yes. All right. That's one factor, too, that plays a role in plaque development in the arteries. Also, it affects the circulatory system because it damages, when the blood glucose levels stay high, it affects from the tiny blood vessels, even down into their toes, to the large blood vessels like the aorta coming off the heart. And the ones in the brain, throughout the ones in the kidney, every single blood vessel is affected. The ones in the eye, the ones in the liver, the ones in the kidney. So throughout the body, the blood vessels are affected and become damaged because the elevated blood sugar acts as an inflammatory factor too. So what happens then, you have the blood vessels become affected, they're damaged, especially in your lower extremity. Your circulation's low in your lower extremity anyway, right? So as those blood vessels become affected, we don't have as good circulation in our toes and our feet. We get a sore. Do they heal? No, they do not. We get infection? Yes. Can they fight infection? No. So pretty soon we're amputating. Okay? So the toes will become black, right? Very dark. And so all of those are typical telltale signs.
How can they bleed out?
Pardon?
How can they bleed out? Like,
Why? Okay, so lots of times they're going to be taking drugs to lower their statins, the cholesterol-lowering drugs, and they're also taking blood thinners. 9 times out of 10, they're taking all of those heart meds to thin their blood, right? So that's one of the main reasons. Anticoagulants, and often they'll bleed out for that reason. But yes, indeed, it's going to affect every single blood vessel. So can it lead to blindness? Yes, because it affects the blood vessels in the back of the eye, the retina, right? Does it affect the kidneys? Lead to kidney failure? Absolutely. all the blood vessels from the little to the large throughout the body. Does that make sense? And so we have another test that we use other than fasting, and I'm going to go over it because you guys are going to have a homework assignment, and it's called hemoglobin A1C. Hemoglobin. I know we're running low on time, but this is very important because we have a lot of diabetes mellitus type 2.
Yeah,
Hemoglobin.
we do, especially in older
A1C.
patients. I mean, the majority of our older patients on home health
All right.
are diabetic.
So for a patient with type 2 diabetes mellitus, we want an A1C lower than 6. All right. And the scale, and I'm just going to read it off to you guys so you'll understand. This is the glucose that circulates and attaches to the red blood cells. All right. And it shows the blood glucose for the last 3 months, because red blood cells have a life of 3 to 4 months. So this A1C tells what their blood sugar was the last 3 months. Can they cheat on this one? They can cheat on fasting, right? They can do real well the night before and bring the blood sugars down, right? They can't cheat on A1C. That's when we like to use it. So if they've been doing poorly and their blood sugar's been running high, if they have a hemoglobin A1C of 6, their average blood glucose has been 135. Is that still a little high? Yeah, it is. A 7 is 170, an 8 is 205, a 9 is 240, a 10 is 275, an 11 is 310, and a 12 is 345 milligrams per deciliter. Is that super high? That's off the roof, right? So they can't cheat on their A1C. So either the meds are off, they need to change their meds, they may need to start taking insulin, or they're going to really have to get up. If they can get moving, watch their carbs, not eat so many starchy foods, really monitor their diet, they can help to bring those blood sugars down so their A1Cs aren't so high. But you guys are going to be watching. You want those A1Cs less than 6. Okay, because they're already at 6 on 135. 135, a lot of doctors say, okay, you're fine, but we know 100 is normal, right? But for a diabetic patient with diabetes mellitus, they'll take it.
There's some diabetics that live in the higher scale, but when
Sevens
you
and
go to the
eights.
doctor, it's like, oh, well, that's normal for them.
For them, right. But are they still causing damage to the retina and the kidneys? Sure they are. So the best thing you can do, get them up, get them moving, keep them off those starchy foods, right? And add some fiber, right? Good luck with that, right? And diet. And meds play a big role. All right. So you can see how this works. So you can see how stress will really raise that blood sugar and raise, if they've been ill for a while, their A1C will go up. Okay? Also, a telltale sign of type 2 diabetes mellitus is the dark rings under the armpit. And you have a picture in your book. It's on page 181. It's called acanthosis nigricans. You guys will see it. Acanthosis nigricans, meaning dark. Dark ring. It looks like a dirty ring around the neck or anywhere there's a joint. Okay? So it could be in the fingers. It could be in the elbows. Typically, it's the underarm region around the neck. It's like they've never washed their neck. It'll become very dark. This indicates elevated insulin production, which is a telltale sign for type 2 diabetes. Okay? So be watching for that. If you have a family member, maybe they're overweight, they have the dark under the armpits, dark rings around their fingers or their joints, this acanthosis nigricans is a telltale sign for type 2 diabetes mellitus, okay? All right, so this is just showing you how the hormones work. You guys go back. All right, so what's the physiological difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus? And remember, we're saying diabetes mellitus, right? What is the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus? If you need some help, it's on page 179. By the way, is there a genetic link between both of them? Yeah. So what's the physiological difference between type 1 and type 2? All right, now list the complications for type 1 and type 2. What are the disease complications from the type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus? It's on page 179. What's disease complications from type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus? You guys are going to be dealing with patients. You need to know. So what is the physiological difference between type 1 and type 2, and what are the disease complications associated with both diseases of type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus? All right, one other thing I'm going to mention, because we're going to talk about this one a little bit later. With type 1, a telltale sign in diagnoses is they'll have elevated ketones. We'll talk about this one a little bit later.
What was that second part of that question on that time?
What are the disease complications for the diseases? So this is elevated ketones, which cause the blood to become very acidic. So ketoacidosis, which can be life-threatening, is very characteristic of type 1. So the breath will be very fruity. Again, they may become very dizzy as those ketones build up. They cause the blood to become very acidic. It will cause electrolyte imbalance in the body, and they can die. Okay? So the ketones produced from the fatty acid metabolism is just to keep the patient alive. It's our body's response to keep the patient alive. But it's a telltale sign of type 1 diabetes mellitus. Okay? And so you'll think they're drunk in their behavior, and they'll smell like they've been drinking alcohol because you'll smell the fruity breath, and that's the ketones on the breath. Okay? So you know they're running ketones. We'll talk a little bit more about ketoacidosis later on, but I want you guys to get a feel for type 1 versus type 2 diabetes mellitus. Okay? Metabolic syndrome, we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into the lipid chapter. We see a lot of patients with metabolic syndrome. Hypoglycemia, when do we classify a patient with hypoglycemia? When they have blood sugars are less than what? 50 milligrams per deciliter. It's hypo, meaning what? Low blood glucose. All right, so this is overall effects on the organs, and we talked about type 1 and type 2 and all the symptoms and so forth. All right, so what does insulin do to blood sugar? What does glucagon do to blood sugar? And what does epinephrine do to blood sugar? Each one of these, do they raise or lower? What does insulin do? What does glucagon do? What does epinephrine do? You don't have to write the question, just the answer. Does insulin raise or lower? Does glucagon raise or lower? Does epinephrine raise or lower blood sugar? And that's on page 183 if you need it. Page 183. And we talked about this a while ago. So does insulin raise or lower? Glucagon raise or lower? Epinephrine raise or lower blood glucose? What's the other name for blood glucose? Blood dextrose. Good answer. Mm-hmm. All right, so glycemic index of food. So on page 185, it talks about glycemic index foods. Some foods don't raise the blood sugar as quickly as other foods, and so they have a glycemic index code they give them. And again, the load is how much of that food you're eating. So white bread has a high glycemic index of 100.
What was the other one, insulin for the
Epinephrine. Epinephrine. This fight or flight hormone. Okay. So a lot of patients, if they're wanting to kind of help to moderate their blood sugars, they can use lower glycemic index foods. And there's a table on 185. You guys can go back to that one. All right. And that's just showing you those with high glycemic index versus those with low glycemic index. Very good with patients. And then we say with diabetic patients, half the calories should come from carbs, but really not more than that. Names of sugar used in foods. Anything with OL is a sugar alcohol. And things like sorbitol, those are artificial sweeteners in foods. And they can get into colon and draw water, and guess what happens? You get diarrhea. So if you give kids a lot of sugar alcohols, get ready for taking them to the bathroom, right? Sorbitol and those sugar alcohols, cause issues. So those are other names when you're looking at labels of names of sugar. All right, we talked about excessive sugar and high fiber diets. All right, we're not going to go to that one. Saccharin has a bitter taste when cooking. Aspartame can't be used in cooking. Contains phenylalanine. You're not supposed to get these hot. All right, NutraSweet is aspartame, and in fact, they say soda, it can be converted into methanol when it gets too hot. It's very dangerous. So you kind of watch. That's some other artificial sweeteners. Stevia is the new guy in town. He actually came from the rainforest originally. Sucralose is an altered sucrose, basically, where your body can't not digest and absorb it. Okay. Aspartame, we'll talk more about it. If the patient has PKU, they can't use the aspartame. All right, and that's some other names of some sugar sweeteners. Okay. All right, let's call it a day. You guys ready to take your test? We had a long day. All right, so let's stop.